On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I'm Jeff Collins, your moderator for this evening, and it's now my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest for tonight, Mustafa Akyol. Mustafa is a Turkish political commentator and author based in Istanbul, Turkey. He dissects Turkish politics as a columnist for Hurriyet Daily News, the leading English-language newspaper in Turkey. And he also writes for the website Al Monitor. And he has a weekly column with the International New York Times. His 2011 book, Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty, calls for an interpretation of Islam that synthesizes liberal ideas and respect for the Islamic tradition. He's also done a widely acclaimed TED Talk, which is called Faith versus Tradition in Islam. And I can say from my own experience that Mustafa is really a welcome voice of reason and objectivity among Turkish commentators. We've known each other a long time, and I'm very glad that you were able to come and join us. So ladies and gentlemen, here to speak about Turkey, developments in Turkey and its region, please join me in welcoming Mustafa Akyol. Turkey has been in the midst of some very difficult events over the last year, and there's a great deal of turmoil in its region, obviously. So domestically, Turkey has experienced three major events in the last year. First, last summer, riots swept the country. They began after a small protest in Istanbul over the government's plans to tear down a park called Gezi Park, were put down violently by police, which led to an eruption in Istanbul and the country. And these protests really were channeling anger against Turkey's Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Many saw him as increasingly autocratic and authoritarian. So in those protests, 5 died and hundreds were injured. The second event was last December. Erdogan and his ruling Justice and Development Party, or AKP, they were implicated in a major corruption scandal, which led to the resignation of 3 high-level Turkish ministers. And what happened is those ministers were accused of essentially taking bribes for major construction projects, which they then gave to their friends and family. Now, Erdogan himself was implicated in this scandal when an audio recording leaked or was posted on the internet, which appeared to have him instructing his son Bilal to hide millions of dollars or millions of euros in cash. Now, Erdogan called that plot fabricated. He said it was all part of a plot by Fethullah Gulen, the Turkish Islamic cleric who lives in Pennsylvania in the United States. They had once been allies, but then they split. And then last, in May of this year, an explosion at a mine in a town called Soma, Turkey, killed 301 people. It was the worst industrial disaster in Turkish history. And protesters around the country essentially blamed the government for lax standards. Erdogan, again, provoked some outrage because of his lackadaisical response. So he visited Soma and commented that, quote, this is what happens in coal mines. So hundreds of family members in Soma were really outraged and protested, called him and the government murderer and thief. Just briefly, the international issues are somewhat obvious when you just look at the map around Turkey. You have civil war in Syria, you have near civil war in Iraq, and then across the Black Sea you have Russian annexation of Crimea. So we'll get to those. But I'd like to start with Prime Minister Erdogan. As you can tell from my remarks, everything in Turkey essentially revolves around Erdogan these days. He's involved somehow in every scandal, he's part of every political discussion, and he really sets the tone for what happens. So let me ask you, Mustafa, what is your view of Erdogan and how he has changed in the over 10 years he's been in power? He'll be running in the presidential election, Turkey's first democratic presidential election in a month. What are his chances of winning, and if he does, what does it mean for Turkey?
Well, Jeff, thank you for summarizing the Turkish scene, and thanks for the Council for hosting us in the first place. Things in Turkey are pretty complicated, as you pointed out. And Indeed, in these three different scandals, I think Erdogan did the wrong thing in the three of these events. In the Gezi Park protests, he should have listened to the protesters. They had some demands. Some of them were right or wrong, whatever, but he should have said, well, people have a right to protest and it's a part of democracy. Abdullah Gul, the president, said that, and he tried to calm the protesters down and reconcile with them. But Erdogan's answer was to say, oh, they are traitors to the nation. They are fifth columns of foreign powers which want to destabilize Turkey. So he reverted to this very conspiratorial rhetoric, which has been a part of Turkish political life for a long time. Erdogan himself was blamed to be a part of a conspiracy against the secular order. And he had actually criticized those kind of approaches, ultra-nationalists. But he reverted back to that old logic. A famous conspiracy theory devised by a journalist who became Erdogan's advisor right after the Gezi Park protests was that it was the German company Lufthansa which was behind the old protests. Why? Well, one of the demands of the protesters was that the new airport in Istanbul should be stopped. There's a new airport that Erdogan is building. It will be the world's biggest airport. I personally am sympathetic to the idea. I like development and more jobs. But these are environmentalists. They're crazy for the trees, and they think 1 million trees will be cut. They're against that, whatever. But instead of understanding that they're like a Greenpeace environmentalist movement, this gentleman said, it is Lufthansa because Lufthansa is a rival to Turkish Airlines, so it must be some foreign conspiracy who's paying these people to do this. It was ridiculous, but that gentleman became the top advisor to Erdogan, and he became pumping these theories. So Erdogan reverted back to the parochial, paranoid nationalism that I have been very critical. And Erdogan was actually critical against these things until a few years ago when he was doing reforms and he was blamed by the same logic. In the second issue, the corruption scandal, there I give Erdogan one point. The fact that he's been wiretapped and those wiretaps have been put on YouTube right before the elections show that somebody did wiretap him and somebody was watching him. Whether they were the prosecutors that are political motive, these things need to be disputed, discussed. And I do also see a political motive behind the corruption investigation. However, the evidence that was found in the investigation is also important. I mean, somebody was watching him, yes, but what they found is also important. I mean, a lot of stacks of money and interesting wiretaps and so on and so forth. But of course, Erdogan and his supporters decided only to say, okay, this is a conspiracy against us, against to topple our government. And they just denied everything that is documented in this investigation. And it also increased this paranoid rhetoric and the political division in the country. And third, with Soma, well, Erdogan came and said, well, such accidents happen. They happened in 19th century England. He gave an example of, and people are wondering, why are you not interested in cutting edge technology and not giving us the example of 19th century England? He did a bad job there as well. And I'm somebody who supported Erdogan. I should be honest here. I've supported Erdogan and his party for a long time. I voted for them, and with my writing, I supported them because they came as a party that promises change and reform, and they have realized a lot of important reforms. From the Kurdish issue to European Union, and the fact that they were conservative Muslims was not a problem for me. I said, it is actually good. Here you have a party with conservative Islamic credentials, but taking the liberal path towards European Union and towards change and progress. But as Erdogan became more dominant on the political system, he, instead of criticizing authoritarianism of the old elite and so on and so forth, he started to assume the power, enjoy the power, use it for a new era of nepotism and emboldening his own rule and his people. That's why we have seen a fast devolution of the political scene, and Erdogan's rhetoric changed from a rhetoric of European Union, progress, civil liberties, to a rhetoric of enemies outside, enemies within, conspiracies, enemies, and standing strong, and so on and so forth. And the national will. He represents the national will. And that's why Turkey is very polarized today. Erdogan's opponents call him a dictator, and he says, if I'm a dictator, come beat me at the elections. And he does win the elections, and he is popular. We should see that. But his understanding of democracy growingly looks like not a liberal democracy, but what Fareed Zakaria has called as illiberal democracy, where there are ballots, there are free elections, but whomever wins the elections disrespects civil liberties, pressures the media, assumes all power without checks and balances. So that's why it's not an accident that Erdogan recently said, openly he said, democracy is about elections, period. And he wins the elections, and once he wins the elections, he thinks he can manipulate the media, even the judiciary, and now he wants to have this presidential system in which he will be the president, he will have a loyal prime minister, so control the whole executive, he will control legislative too as his party remains in power. He's bringing designs that he will control to some extent the judiciary as well. Because the president has the powers to appoint members to the constitutional court and higher bodies. While he controls a great deal of the Turkish media, that's not a secret. And that's a lot of control and a lot of power. And as someone who has supported Erdogan's reformism in the past, I'm growingly critical, I'm growingly worried about the direction he has taken. And I see Turkey as a great example of illiberal democracy today, not a liberal one, unfortunately.
So let's probe some of the things you said a bit. So you mentioned the deep polarization in Turkey, but according to the polls, it looks like Erdogan should win the presidential election fairly easily. His party won local elections, whereas the Turkish opposition parties have been seen as pretty much feckless in the last in the time AKP has been in power since 2002. The two main opposition parties, MHP and CHP, have now come together to support a candidate, Mr. Ihsanolu, who was the ambassador to the Islamic Organization Conference.
Islamic Cooperation Organization, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
Thank you. So
it's complicated.
With those parties joining together to back a candidate, what are their chances, and is there any realistic chance that they could defeat Erdogan?
Well, why Erdogan is still very successful and very popular? He is successful. I mean, trains run on time. Infrastructure has improved. Turkish economy has boomed at a time when Greece is collapsing and other countries in the region are in trouble. And besides all these economic improvements, Erdogan also liberated Turkey's religious conservatives who have been oppressed and humiliated by a secular elite. Because unfortunately in Turkey, secularism did not mean the separation of church and state and thus freedom of religion. It came from France and this a little oppressive secularism. So religious conservatives, which make maybe half of Turkish society, did not feel as equal citizens. You could not wear a headscarf and go to the campus. Erdogan saved the religious conservatives. He gave them the freedom and the dignity that they were looking for, and that's fine. But now, with all that support, he's looking as he's turning the table upside down and making the more secular part of society the new underclass. And that's where he's going wrong. But he's very popular among all the religious conservatives because of all this liberation he has brought to them, plus the economic benefits. Well, what should happen? What should happen is that the opposition should be more appealing, more charming, and more competent. And unfortunately, the big problem in Turkish politics right now is that Erdogan is too dominant and the opposition has been too weak, too incompetent, basically. And, well, our main secular, mainstream opposition, what they promised for the first 10 years of the 21st century to the electorate was that the headscarf should be banned in the campus. That was their big issue. I mean, they were so parochial-minded, and they were always quoting Ataturk as quoting from chapter verse from the Bible. I mean, yes, Ataturk did good things in the 30s, but we live in a different world. You had to move forward and improve and so on and so forth. They are now beginning to realize that they have made a big mistake. They're trying to open up. They're trying to speak about the economy, about jobs, but it will take for some time for them to mature. In this current election, what they did was actually smart. There's Erdogan, the presidential candidate, the big, majestic Erdogan. I mean, he has this at least 45% of the votes. He's solid there. The opposition parties is the secular People's Republican Party, which has some 25, 26%. Then comes the Turkish nationalists with 16%. So when you add them up, it almost makes as much as Erdogan. They showed a joint candidate against Erdogan as a rival. And this candidate, surprisingly, comes from an Islamic background. Mm-hmm. So they said, well, if you want to defeat Erdogan, there should be someone who has the same religious credentials, with Erdogan. And they have shown Ekmelettin İhsanoğlu, as you said, he's a scholar, he's an academic. He was the head of the Organization of Islamic Conference. He's Islamic too, but he's not Islamist. He emphasizes that. So I think he's at more peace with the secular values of the Republic, although he himself being a religious person. And I think it's a progress for the mainstream opposition to show him as a candidate. It shows that they are also making peace with religious values. Yet still, although I have sympathies for İhsanoğlu, I think he's a perfect gentleman who would be a great president. Erdogan is such a fighter that has so much more appeal to the common voter than İhsanoğlu is. It's like putting Mike Tyson, the big boxer, and a very polite person in the same ring. Tyson can beat him, in that sense. So I think it is likely that Erdogan will win the presidency and become the first popularly elected president of Turkey. And this will be a second era of Erdogan. And we don't know how that will go, of course. His game plan is to win the presidency for 2 terms, 5 plus 5, 10 years. So from 2014 to 2024, he wants to go at least for 10 more years.
So, Mustafa, let me ask you about a couple more figures. You mentioned Erdogan's strong support among religious conservatives, yet we have Fethullah Gulen, who I mentioned, who has a very strong following both in Turkey and internationally, having split with Erdogan last year. How important is that split? How will it affect elections? And maybe tell the audience a bit about Gulen. I know you know the Gulenist community a bit, and what that split means for Turkey.
Sure. I mean, that's such a complicated issue, and it's really hard to explain. People say, what's their problem? Aren't they all conservative Sunni Muslims who have similar values and lifestyles? Yes, they are. But there has been this interesting shift and conflict that has really shaped Turkish politics in the past 6 months. Let's define, for example, who they are. Erdogan is the leader of this party, AKP. He's a political leader. Fethullah Gülen, he's not a political figure. He's the head of a community. He's a charismatic, let's say, leader. He would be the leader of moral majority, from the US, maybe, example, like a person who has a religious following. And Gulen movement is the most organized Islamic community in Turkey. They have a big media presence. They have schools all over the world. They have NGOs. They are moderate in their preaching. They are reaching out to Jews, Christians, and other faiths. They're trying to show the morality of Islam. They distance themselves from radical Islamic movements. And they supported Erdogan in his battle against the military and the secular authoritarians that really used to dominate the state. How did they support? Well, by their media, and plus, it is whispered in Turkey for a long time that the members of the Gulen movement, some of them also joined the police force and the judiciary to create a balance in these institutions against the traditional secular elite which dominates. Word has it that Erdogan strengthened these prosecutors and police, trusting them as the good Muslims against these old narrow-minded secularists. However, when the old enemy was defeated, these two camps found themselves in power in different ways, but also disagreeing about the Kurdish policy, about the policy vis-a-vis the West, vis-a-vis Israel, vis-a-vis the United States. Generally, it would be fair to say the Gulen movement insisted on a more pro-Western stance on foreign policy, and Erdogan growingly asserted a more Middle Eastern type of Islamism in some of his rhetoric. On the other hand, Erdogan was more willing to make peace with the Kurdish separatists. Gulen movement was not very much willing to see that. They were more skeptical about the Kurdish separatists. These disagreements came to the fore after they defeated the old guard. And in Turkey, I have a rule, the Murphy's rule of Turkey version, that if there's a little disagreement, it will turn into a fight for sure, because Turks cannot handle disagreement. I mean, our people. And it turned into a big, bitter dispute, and both sides began to suspect each other's motives. And Erdogan declared that he will close down all the educational institutions of the Gulen movement. This, of course, created a lot of reaction from the Gulen movement, rightly. Then a month later, this corruption investigation began, and Erdogan said they must be the prosecutors that are actually tied to the Gulen movement. This is a political operation. Maybe he had a point. But the prosecutors found some reasonable evidence that also is important. And after that, Erdogan said, this Gulen movement, these are not good Muslims. They're spies working for, again, the foreign government. The fifth column theory came to the fore, and he denounced them as the enemy within, which is trying to block Turkey's progress, and so on and so forth. I should say, in terms of their understanding of Islam, I think the Gulen movement presents an asset for both Turkey and the Muslim world, in the sense that they preach tolerance, diversity, they reach out to Jews and Christians, and that's why hardcore Islamists blame them in Turkey to be the lovers of the infidels and so on and so forth. So the hardcore Islamists. That's their assets, but also I think if they had a presence in the police and the judiciary in a way which turned those institutions to their advantage, that's a problem too. So that should not go on. But on the other hand, whomever as a prosecutor is, if that prosecutor found an important evidence about corruption, I cannot trash that out as well. So it is this interesting conundrum. But the rhetoric has become so divisive, and today Erdogan almost every day lashes out against the Gulen movement, defines them as this hidden espionage group. I mean, it sounds like some of the rhetoric against the Trotskyites. I mean, if you look at the Soviet Union in the 30s. They have infiltrated everywhere, and behind every spot there is this hidden enemy, which was once your ally, but they sold themselves to the capitalists and so on and so forth. So it is really bad in that sense. I think if there are two sides here, both sides made a mistake in terms of trying to achieve more and more power. But I think right now it is Erdogan probably making more injustice in this battle, because he's now trying to uproot the Gulen movement by disestablishing their NGOs, going after their companies, and so on and so forth. If certain members of the Gulen movement in the police or judiciary created a parallel state, as he called it, like acting with their own hierarchy, it's like a Freemason conspiracy theory. Like they do their own thing in there. They have those powers, but they have which could be the case, and Erdogan should prove this and take this to justice, and that's fine. But why does he go and try to close Gulen schools in Afghanistan or Azerbaijan? I mean, that has no explanation other than political vengeance. Vengeance is the game here, and it's a very bad game. And Erdogan, unfortunately, loves to play that game.
We should mention that Erdogan, of course, is pushing the Obama administration to have Gulen go back to Turkey. But something you alluded to, I think, is interesting. I think something Erdogan's been very successful at doing is, even though he clearly has all of the power in Turkey and has really sidelined the military and other checks on his power, he still, and his party still play the victim very well, and they turn these negative events to their advantage by blaming others. But let me ask you one more question about individuals. We got some questions from the audience that kind of probe options other than Erdogan. Someone asked about the possibility of term limits in Turkey. Someone asked, actually the question we hear a lot about the election threshold in Turkey. So parties have to get, is it 10%?
10%, yeah.
If they don't, none of their votes count. So if it were lowered, perhaps there would be an ability to have a coalition government that's not the AKP. But on that theme, let me ask you about President Abdullah Gul. So he's generally seen as the more moderate figure, the more reasonable figure, liked more in international circles. And I think people saw that he was more reasonable when it came in over the last several years to Turkey's bans of internet websites like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, and he made some comments against that. And many, I think, have hoped that he would challenge Erdogan at some point, but he really never has broken with Erdogan in public. So what is your analysis of President Gul's thinking, and what do you think his next steps will be? Does he want to be Prime Minister of Turkey when Erdogan moves to be president?
Well, President Gül is a figure which still makes me hopeful about Turkey's future. I think he's an asset for anybody who wants liberal democracy in Turkey, because I think he genuinely believes in these democratic liberal values. Gül is actually the founder of the AKP. I mean, Erdogan joined it and became the leader, but Gül is it's his brainchild. Unfortunately for him, though, once he left the party in 2007 and became the president, the party went its own way and gradually became more parochial and narrow-minded, whereas Gül actually even had a more progressive route as president. That is why he, in the past 2 years, clearly disputed Erdogan by taking different positions. Erdogan had Twitter banned. Gül entered Twitter, like me and millions of other people, by using a mirror site and wrote on Twitter, "I hope this Twitter ban will end. Twitter should be free." And Erdogan wasn't happy about that. So in many positions like this. However, on the other hand, Gül, if he wants a political future for himself, still has to rely on the conservative base that Erdogan also operates on. So he didn't want to openly have a political clash with Erdogan. And he was realizing how powerful Erdogan is. So he put his difference, he disagreed at times. I know he silently tried to block some of the excesses of the government behind the doors, hoping that this madness will calm down and maybe he will be able to articulate and represent some of his views in politics. Today, Gül's term is ending. He's finishing his term ends at the end of August. That's why Erdogan will be probably elected. Gül might come back to politics if Erdogan cannot control the AKP, because when he becomes president, he will be technically cut off from it's not like US, you are cut off from your party. The president has to be technically neutral. Everybody thinks that Erdogan will want to have a yes president, prime minister, who will be loyal to him and control it by remote control. But if he cannot do that and the party loses steam, there are people in the AKP who would prefer that moderatism and reconciliatory approach rather than this chest beating and this machismo that's going on. So there's a chance that Gül might appear as a political figure, and that'd be a good scenario for all liberals, I think. But the other scenario is that Erdogan will get such a huge victory in the presidential elections, and he will just put a loyal prime minister, and he will control politics with the loyal prime minister, and nobody else will be around him as a balancing figure. And that would be the negative scenario from a liberal point of view. Therefore, I think, yes, Gül could have done more to put his difference or challenge Erdogan, but if he'd done that, maybe he would be killing his own chances to appeal to the conservative base and maybe have a new restoration in the future. That's why I find Gül to be, I still see him as a promise for the future.
So that will be a very interesting dynamic to watch. Let me ask you one more domestic question, and then we'll turn to foreign policy. We've got some questions about Syria, about ISIS, and the Kurdish
We have
issue.
a tough neighborhood, trust me.
But a few people asked about religious minorities in Turkey. And in with Western audiences, we're often asked about the increasing religiosity in Turkey. So I want to ask you to talk a little bit about that. When AKP first came to power, they were very guarded about how they talked about religion. So they would talk about rights and liberties, but they wouldn't really press openly about the headscarf or other issues, whereas now they appear much more willing to talk, now that they have a great deal of control to talk about religious issues. But at the same time, they've done some good for religious minorities. So is the AKP, is Turkey becoming more religious, or is the AKP just opened up space for the society to express its natural conservatism?
I think it's the latter. I don't think more people became more observant in Turkey, but the observant conservative people have become more visible and dominant in the political scene and even society to some extent. And in some sense, that's a normal thing, and that should be okay, and that should be congratulated. I think the ban on the headscarf in Turkey was secular authoritarianism. I'm against Islamic authoritarianism, but I'm also against secular authoritarianism as well. People should be able to wear what they want, and that can be a miniskirt, and that can be a headscarf. The state should not interfere in any of these choices. In Turkey, the secular tradition was very authoritarian, and Erdogan did the right thing of getting rid of these, of course, bans. Gradually, of course, he did this. I mean, he was not able to touch these issues in the beginning. The military would launch a coup or a closure case, as it did actually in 2008. When we come to the non-Muslim religious minorities in Turkey, well, we are speaking of very tiny communities here. Greeks, Armenians, Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, basically. And there are also Eastern Syriac, ancient Syriac Christian community in the southeast, which speak Aramaic, the language of Jesus. Well, we should give AKP its credit. They have done important reforms for the non-Muslim minorities as well. Because, interestingly, maybe people would think like, oh, an Islamic government comes, that should be negative for the non-Muslims. It didn't work that way in Turkey, because in Turkey, the real oppression on the Greeks or the Armenians was coming from nationalist reasons. Turkey's secular generals, out of nationalism, had closed churches because they were angry at the Greeks for Cyprus. And that's why religious freedom regressed in Turkey during the 20th century, while under the Islamic Ottoman Empire, there was more religious freedom for the non-Muslims. Erdogan is an Ottomanist. So he came with a promise for change, for freedom for everybody, including the Christians. So he opened up some closed churches. He gave the ecumenical patriarchate some of the rights that it was denied by the central government. That's why he got some support from the Armenian community and so on and so forth. But also, he has this kind of a Ottoman Sultan psychology. I mean, he gives these rights as benevolence, and he wants some appreciation and some, loyalty. So he has been positive regarding diversity and religious diversity in society and religious minorities. But, for example, there are still steps that he hasn't taken. For example, he has not reopened the Halki Seminary, which is a big issue of the ecumenical patriarchate. There, and I think he's also being stopped or blocked by the same logic that blocked the older elites, the idea of reciprocity between Turkey and Greece. There's no Athens, there's no mosque in Athens, because the Greeks are they don't have a great record regarding the religious freedom of the Turks in Greece as well. So it is, you don't give them their rights, we don't give them their rights. It's like this eye for an eye, but in a very negative sense. Well, my argument is that let's liberate our Greeks and let the Greeks liberate their Turks. Why are we just, oppressing our minorities each? But the logic doesn't work that way in that sense. Yet still, I am less worried about Erdogan regarding the Christian minorities. One thing, though, the Jewish community in Turkey are probably alarmed about the anti-Semitic rhetoric in the, not Erdogan's directly words, but in the pro-Erdogan media. And that unfortunately sometimes comes because of a reaction against Israel's policies against the Palestinians. I am against many of those policies as well, such as the killings that's going on in Gaza these days. But of course, that should never ever be translated into anti-Semitism, but some people do that in Turkey. And Erdogan has not done a good job of speaking against those anti-Semitic voices in his own political camp. Because there are a few notoriously anti-Semitic newspapers in Turkey, and they use the reaction against Israel policy sometimes to advance their anti-Semitic narrative. And Erdogan should do a better job of opposing those.
Okay, let me ask you one more domestic question, if you can answer it quickly, because we've received a lot, and one I think that people want to know is about the arrests of journalists and the bans of Twitter. So someone asked, I think this is very interesting, if you as a journalist are critical of Erdogan, what risks do you face? So if you could just briefly address that.
Good question. Well, I don't expect to be killed or tortured or put in jail, but Turkey is not China or North Korea. Let's put it that way. But I could lose my job. And actually I did. I was writing for a newspaper called Star for 7 years. A few months ago, the editor-in-chief of Star called me and he said, sorry, we like you a lot, but we cannot continue anymore. And he said, there are some reactions to what you're writing. And the reaction was coming from the government side, because I was growingly critical of Erdogan in this newspaper, and the paper became growingly more pro-Erdogan because of what's happening behind the scenes. So in Turkey today, if you're a journalist who's against Erdogan, you won't get into jail. You won't end up in a backstreet dead like it can happen in Russia. It's not that bad. But you can be fired because your editor-in-chief can get a direction from the boss who needs to get state contracts from the government, and the government can be telling them, well, you should be nice to us if you want to get that refinery from Ankara. And then the boss says, go easy on Erdogan these days, and especially these two guys, the Erdogan doesn't like them, get rid of them, and you can lose your job. You can still write in a blog or somewhere, but this puts a pressure on most mainstream journalists, makes them a bit more careful about what they're writing. And there has been a lot of very prominent columnists. Like, imagine the New York Times firing Tom Friedman and Roger Cohen and other person because they're notably more critical of Obama than other columnists are. And probably it wouldn't happen here, right? But it happens in Turkey on a systematic basis. So in that sense, Erdogan, and one thing about this media issue, which came out in the scandals of wiretapped conversations. I said there has been a series of wiretapped conversations on the internet between Prime Minister, and you alluded to the one that between him and his son. He denied that conversation. He said it's a fake recording. I don't know what's the reality. But there's a conversation he didn't deny. He said, yes, that's fine. That's true. In this conversation, Erdogan is heard calling the editor-in-chief of Habertürk, a prominent TV channel. He's in Morocco at the time. And he says, from Morocco, he calls, why are you airing this Devlet Bahçeli guy for so many minutes? Devlet Bahçeli is the head of the third opposition party. So he's unhappy that the opposition leader's speech is given for too many minutes, like 5 minutes or something. He doesn't want it to be that visible. And the editor-in-chief says, I'm sorry, sir, I didn't know that. I apologize, sir. Then he calls his subordinates and yells, and you hear in the second conversation, who yells at them. He says, why are you putting this man again? The Prime Minister called me again. He's so angry. And they say, we are sorry, sir, we didn't know. And they take it out. And a few people get fired from Habertürk the other day. And somebody's recording all of this and putting this on YouTube. That's the other part of the story. Turkey is a complicated country.
Okay,
and this is like one of the examples. So, and Prime Minister, he was questioned about it. He said, yes, of course. He said, I made a conversation. I told them, because we have to teach the media how to be good patriotic journalists. Uh-huh. So he doesn't see a problem in this. And that's because he thinks democracy is just about the ballots. Don't forget that. He gets the ballots, so all else follows.
So let's talk about Turkey's region and see if that's any less difficult for the government.
Sure.
So
that's even more complicated.
A few years ago, of course, Turkey's foreign policy was dubbed zero problems with neighbors. They were increasing trade and had very strong relations with Syria. Obviously, many things have changed. Let's start with Kurdistan. We had some people in the audience interested about that. That has been a 180-degree turn in the relationship. So just 4 or 5 years ago, the Turkish government viewed the Kurdish regional government as essentially its enemy and supporting the pro-Kurdish terrorist PKK movement, the Kurdish insurgency in Turkey. But now we fast forward to today, and they have very good relations, excellent trade relations. And I also wonder if Turkey's support of Kurdistan now is going to push toward the split of Iraq into 3, which many believe will happen. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about why Turkey flipped and what its relationship with the KRG, with Kurdistan, means now for its neighbor Iraq.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are good things in Turkey and bad things in Turkey. And I think one of the good things is that the Kurdish front is going fine. Erdogan has been able to, first of all, offer a peace deal to Turkey's own Kurdish separatists, the PKK. That's going on. The violence between the PKK and Turkey, which claimed 40,000 lives, a huge conflict, is at least dormant right now. There's a ceasefire, and we hope that the PKK will say farewell to arms, and this will be sold like IRA and British deal. Maybe not that easy, but that's at least something that Erdogan is trying, and I still support him on that. And he also has been able to have a policy of rapprochement towards Iraqi Kurdistan. He has befriended Barzani, and as you said, Turkey signed a deal recently, an oil deal. Kurds will be able to sell their oil via Turkey through a pipeline to the Mediterranean. This also solidified the strategic alliance between the two partners. And it would not be a surprise if Iraqi Kurds declare independence and Turkey supports them and becomes their best friend. How this was possible? Well, let's not forget that Erdogan represents a different identity and mindset than his secular predecessors. Erdogan's secular predecessors were secular, but also very nationalist. The Turkish nationalist identity had an inherent clash with the Kurdish identity. It was like you don't want to accept that there are Kurds. You want to Turkify all of them, because if there are different Turkish and Kurdish identity in Turkey, Turkey will be separated. Erdogan came by saying, I'm an Ottomanist. In the Ottoman Empire, everybody was Turkish, Kurdish, Jewish, no problem. In this sense, he has been more pluralist. And of course, this doesn't solve his problem with the Alavis or with the secular people. That's a different angle. But he has been better at reaching out to the Kurds, accepting who they are, opening up a Kurdish language TV station, accepting Kurdish education. So he turned this decades-old Kurdophobia of Turkish ruling elite into friendship with the Kurds. And this has worked fine. And other foreign policy and the efforts of the current government, like zero problems with Assad regime, didn't work that way, and it turned into a bitter enmity. But I think one of the good remaining results of that zero problem policy is the Iraqi Kurds. And Turkey now relies on Iraqi Kurds, first because of that strategic partnership with oil. Secondly, Turkey is very concerned about the Iranian influence, plus more than that, by this so-called ISIS, this fanatic group inside Iraq and Syria. And Kurds are a buffer zone right now between them and Turkey. And Turkey was very happy that the Kurds took Kirkuk and not ISIS. So in this sense, Kurds have become a liberator from this very aggressive extremist Salafi force that also threatens Turkish interests and kidnap Turkish citizens as well. So in that sense, I think if there's one bright spot in Turkish politics and political foreign policy especially, it's the alliance with the Kurds. And that is not surprising when we understand Erdogan's logic and his way of identity politics.
So I want to ask you a little bit more about events in the region and a little bit about your book, which is incredibly insightful, very well done, and I would say inspirational. One of the things, and let me start with this debate now about whether the Arab Spring has failed. So The Economist had this on its cover recently. Another prominent columnist in Europe went further and said, "Is the Arab Spring turned into a complete debacle?" Now, in your book, you argue that social and political problems in the Middle East, so from honor killings to Islamic terrorism to lack of democracy, have nothing to do with the Quran itself, but come from later interpretations of the Quran. And then you argue that 20th century colonialism in the Middle East has in essence squelched Islamic modernism and led to a really defensive mindset, a rigid nationalistic mindset, and in some cases given rise to strident Islamist groups. So with that background, let me just pose the question to you. Is the Arab Spring dead? And do you see any room for Islamic modernism to reemerge?
Well, that's a big question, but it's an important question, and thanks for bringing that up. And is the Arab Spring dead? Well, when he was asked about whether the French Revolution was a good idea, Chinese leader Su Enlai in the middle of the 20th century, he said, it's too early to tell. So I think it's too early to tell. It's been just 2-3 years. And it has worked fine in Tunisia so far. The only place that the Arab Spring worked well is where it began, Tunisia. Because why? Tunisians are a more educated society. They have a more urban population, and they have civil society institutions. And Tunisian Islamists, under the leadership of the party of Nahda, are more moderate, more liberal-leaning compared to Egyptian Islamists and other Islamists. They've just drafted a pretty liberal, good constitution with a consensus. So I'm happy with the Tunisians, and I congratulate them. I actually even wrote an article that Turkey should take the Tunisian model as an example, at least the model of consensus rather than fighting all day about minor details. But we know how it unfolded into a military coup and violence and viciousness in Egypt. In Syria, a horrible civil war. In Libya, still the civil war goes on with different camps trying to dominate the system. But let's not also forget that, the French Revolution took a lot of decades to establish a democracy in France. Then came the terror, the Jacobins, and the Bonapartean empire, and so on and so forth. I think the Arab Spring initiated an era in which the Arab societies believe that you can topple a dictator and you can bring freedom. But when you say freedom, if you have deep cleavages in that society, whose freedom? Is it mine? Who will dominate? Those questions can evolve into clashes. And when you have sectarian, of course, dimensions to this, it can get worse. So the Arab Spring just opened up a Pandora's box, and some good is coming out of that, and some evil is coming out of that. And while in Syria, what is happening is what, as Turkish President Abdullah Gul said, is it's the dark ages of Islam. It's like the 17th century Europe, Catholics and Protestants killing each other because calling each other heretic and infidels and so on and so forth. Europeans have gone through those experiences, and ultimately they came to the principle of democracy and pluralism and so on and so forth. Well, how long we will go through those experiences is something we're discussing, of course, in the Middle East. Well, my book, what it offers, my book offers a theory of Islamic liberalism, basically. And liberalism, I use it in the very classical sense, the idea of individual freedom. And one thing I'm saying is that we have so many authoritarianisms and authoritarian injunctions, like apostates are being killed, like you have the Islamic versions of the Inquisition almost in some places. I'm reminding one thing. Well, the Inquisition did not take place because the New Testament established it. It took place because of a certain political mindset. This is right, this is wrong, and you kill the wrong. But, when Christians reread their scripture and rethought about it, they said, well, we don't have to do this. They reinterpreted their tradition. And hence came the Enlightenment and the Catholic Reformation, and at least Second Vatican, and so on and so forth. I think a same evolution is possible in Islam as well. Because when you look at Islam, its core, much of the troubles we're talking about doesn't directly come from Scripture. There is no stoning in the Quran. There is no killing of apostates. The Quran says good Muslims should pray 5 times a day. It doesn't say there should be a religious police which will flog people if they don't do that. But the ISIS does that because they think this is the thing should be done, do it. That's a certain mindset, and that's a certain interpretation of religion. So my book, Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty, just tackles all these issues and says, let's go try to understand and let's reinterpret these things. Some of them are not even religious, and let's get rid of this. And does this message appeal to Muslims? Yes, it does. In Turkey, if you ask people, should people be stoned to death if they're adulterers? Like their polls, Pew Research made a poll. In Turkey, the people who say yes to stoning is less than 3% of the whole population. In Bosnia, where my wife comes from, nobody says yes, like 0%. But if you go to Pakistan, it is 70% yes. In Egypt, it is 75% yes. So in a society like that, when you have democracy, it might not be a very liberal democracy. Because with the ballots, you can legislate that apostates should be killed. Because 75% people think that apostates should be killed. That's why we should discuss not just Islam and electoral democracy. Many Muslims accept electoral democracy. But we should discuss, what about blasphemy? What about apostasy? Can people change their religion? What about Should you coerce people to be good Muslims? This authoritarianism that is inherent in some religious interpretations. And my book is basically a challenge against that. Does it make sense? It makes sense to some. It doesn't make sense to other Muslims. But these are the issues that we are discussing, I mean, in that part of the world.
So let's bring it back, the Arab Spring question, back
Sure.
to Turkey. So when the Arab Spring broke, I remember being in the White House, and we were really struck by how much Turkey was noted as a possible example for the region and a model for the region. But I'd be curious to hear from you what influence Turkey may have now. Clearly, when their relations were better with Israel, they were seen as kind of an honest broker between Israel and Palestine. In Syria, when the Syrian war broke, they tried to pressure Assad, but clearly that didn't have much effect. So what do you see as Turkey's impact today? What leverage may they have in some of these situations where there is quite a bit of extremism?
Mm-hmm. Well, regarding Israel-Palestine, we need honest brokers between Israel and Palestine, and maybe Turkey tilted too much towards the Palestinian side. And maybe U.S. can tilt a little bit towards the Palestinian side to be an honest broker in that big conflict, but that's a different issue. Turkey, I think, overplayed its hand and expressed so much ambition vis-a-vis control of the Middle East, which actually has been counterproductive. Especially regarding Syria, the narrative of Turkish Foreign Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu, who's of course the brain behind the foreign policy of Erdogan, he emphasized that Turkey is back to the region. We are coming from an Ottoman legacy and we are the game changers and the game makers and so on and so forth. Well, it didn't turn out to be that case. We could not foresee what was happening in Syria. We could not change it. Our support to the opposition did not bring a democracy, it just brought a civil war, and we did not foresee the rise of this ISIS and extremist groups like that. I think too much ambition killed what could have been more successful if Turkey went a bit more cautious. Because I don't think that Turkey can have a freedom agenda and liberate countries and bring democracy, right? I mean, even US could not exactly do that in Iraq. I mean, with all the majestic military and power and everything. We cannot do that in Syria as well. What we can do and what we should do, and we are still doing to some extent, is to be a soft power, to be an example, that the Arabs can look at Turkey, see, here's a Muslim society where there are mosques and but nights club as well, and people are free to choose between them, and here's a good economy and a secular part of society and conservative part of society, and a country that is true to its values, but also who's opening up to the world and creative and dynamic and so on and so forth. Turkey is that. It's still that. And I think our certain political mistakes overshadow that a little bit, but I think that soft power is still there. And you can see this, for example, maybe it's just too symbolic, but look at Turkish soap operas and how they have been so popular in the Arab world. Mm-hmm. I was in Jordan 5 months ago. There are 8 channels and 3 of them play Turkish soap operas. And okay, Brazilian ones were popular too. It didn't make Brazil a big power. But here in that phenomenon, I saw something. I saw the yearning for a Muslim form of modernity, as I call it. Here you have a modern society, a lot of benefits of blessings of modernity. People go for dates and so on and so forth, but there's a mosque, there's some respect for Ramadan, some tradition and so on. So that is what Muslim nations need, rather than a totally alien modernity coming from a different civilization, from Britney Spears, let's say, which is nice in its own way. But you need a more likable, a bit more familiar understanding of the modern world and democracy with your own references. I always say, let's not forget that in the West, liberalism emerged with references to Christianity. John Locke was bringing arguments from the Bible to argue for individual freedom. And Martin Luther King did much better by defending equality for every individual, every human being, by Christian arguments. So we need those kind of locally based culturally, religiously based arguments for change. And Turkey is actually still the model. Well, here it can be. If Erdogan doesn't really push too much of his cultural conservatism, and if he can tame his ambition to control everything in society, I think Turkey is still the model. But I think it's time for us Turks to stop a little bit, be cautious, be less paranoid about conspiracies everywhere, and think where we failed and how can we move forward.
Great. So we have about 5 minutes left. I'm gonna ask you 2 more questions. The first, I think we really have to ask, being in San Francisco and maybe if you were in LA, and that is about Armenia. So we're coming up on the 100-year anniversary of the Armenian genocide, which Turks will not call it a genocide. This year in, year out is a big problem for the American administration, and the Turkish diplomats at a very high level always lobby for the U.S. not to call it a genocide. So I would like to hear your thoughts on Turkey's thinking. You, just as a Turk personally, what do you think Turkey should do, and what do you think countries like the U.S. should do with respect to how they label and look at that period of history?
What we Turks should do is to be more empathetic, to be more understanding about the tragedy of the Armenians. And we chose the unbelievably wrong way of denying that Armenians suffered and just forgetting that and asking everybody to forget that. That was the wrong thing to do. We should understand that hundreds of thousands of Armenians perished in Anatolia because of the decision of the government of the time. We should be sorry, we should apologize, and we should share the pain of the Armenians. Whether to call it genocide or not, that's a different debate. Here, the Turkish reaction generally comes from comparing it to the Holocaust, which is, I think, incomparable. Mm-hmm. The Holocaust came out of the Nazi hatred against Jews, simply out of hatred, ideological, and they exterminated Jews wherever they are in gas chambers. What happened to the Armenians was nothing like this. It was an expulsion, horribly wrong. But Turks were expelled from Balkans and the Caucasus. So it was a time of huge, colossal ethnic conflicts throughout the empire. And my grandfather was a Circassian in the Northern Caucasus. Russians invaded the Northern Caucasus. They fled from there to Anatolia, came to Yozgat, central Anatolia, and they remembered that they did the same thing to us. So it happened in a context like this. That's the only thing I would underline. But Armenians suffered, they remember that suffering, we should understand, we should share that pain. And I support Erdogan for his message of offering condolences for Armenians. He did this like a few months ago, and I still support Erdogan when he does something good, which is not very often, but on this issue I support him. And he was the first statesman in Turkey to say, at least, we offer our condolences for the losses of the Armenians, and it was a mistake. But change will happen not when France or US will push Turks to accept what it is, but when a direct dialogue between us and the Armenians will take place. Because it generally generates a reaction from Turkey when the French parliament issues a law about this. And Turks say, who's the French? Who are they to give us some lecture? Look at what they did in Algeria like 50 years ago. This turns into this blame game. What we need is direct dialogue, and that dialogue is taking place. There are NGOs in Turkey who are bringing people from Armenia to Istanbul, who are bringing Turkey to Armenia, so that people can share their stories and understand who they are. And that will take time, and I think, but that's the healthier way, rather than imposing on Turkey, which generally triggers a nationalist reaction of who's going to lecture us on this thing. That's what I can say on the Armenian
Thank
tragedy.
you. So let's close with U.S.-Turkey. So we're fortunate to have you here visiting us in the U.S. Americans are generally, well, the American government is generally unpopular among Turks. The U.S. and Turkish administrations have had rocky time in the past few years. How can we, as Turks and Americans, both as private citizens and the government, strengthen our relations?
Turkish-American relations were good during the 90s, I must say. Things got really bitter with the Iraqi war because many Turks considered the occupation or liberation of Iraq, how you call it, as an unnecessary war, maybe with some hidden interest for oil and so on and so forth. It created a lot of anti-American rhetoric, and it has not calmed down yet still. The Obama administration brought some change, I must say, towards the positive side, but still there's a lot of course, in Turkish politics also, creating these conspiracy theories about the big powers of the world, which America is one, always sells, unfortunately. I mean, because of our education system and so on and so forth. Yet still, I think that despite all the conspiracy theories that even Erdogan uses these days, as I explained, US and America has common interests, common values even in the Middle East. We don't want groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS to kill people and proliferate and attack societies. We want peace in Israel, between Israel and Palestine. Turkey, at the end of the day, supports a two-state solution. Turkey is not against Israel's existence or security or peace or anything. Turkey just wants a Palestinian state in its pre-67 borders, as President Obama, also said. Turkey doesn't want a nuclear Iran. Turkey tried to broker a deal with Iran in order to be able to stop that nuclear proliferation. So there we agree. Turkey doesn't support, and Turkey is against the Assad regime in Syria, which is murdering its people every day. But now Turkey also recognizes that, a bit belatedly, but there are problems in the opposition as well, and some of the people in the opposition are fanatic. Actually, I think at this stage, they are very close in the way they look at the Middle East. I think Turkey's own internal conspiracy theories and the Gulen movement being the fifth column of American powers that want to topple that nonsense maybe blocked some of the dialogue at home. I think Erdogan needs to stop blaming social groups for being spies for foreign governments, address those social groups. If there are problems, deal with them at home as local issues, and then talk with America and other governments as a reasonable government without any delusions of grandeur or delusions of being the victim all the time. And I think from the US, what will help is the problem with Erdogan. I mean, if you approach Erdogan and say, oh, he's an Islamic fundamentalist, all these Islamists are. The problem, if you ask me, is not that he's an Islamic fundamentalist. He has a problem with being too in love with power. And that's a universal problem. That's not a problem with Islam. That's a universal power problem, intoxication with power, especially you stay in power for a long time, and if you're coming from a patriarchal political culture, that happens. So constructive criticism towards Erdogan government will be more helpful than just saying, oh, they are Islamists and they're showing their true colors and that's who they are. That will push people away, and that will probably be a barrier towards any reasonable dialogue between the US administration and the Turkish government.
Well, Mustafa, we covered a lot of ground. Thank you very much.
More is in my book, which is...
Yes. So...
which is a good read, I must say.
We're unfortunately out of time, and so this concludes our program for this evening. And on behalf of the World Affairs Council, please join me in giving a round of thanks and applause to Mustafa Akyol.